As the dust settles in Gaza, a new battle looms, this one a political battle within Israel. With elections just weeks away, will the war impact the result? And has the offensive really changed the security situation in southern Israeli towns? Israel, divided or united by war? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Kamahl Santamaria. Around 200 years ago, a military theorist named Karl von Clausewitz said, and I'm quoting here, "War is merely a continuation of politics by other means." Now, many would say it still holds true today, but what happens when war fails, or at least doesn't meet its goals? What impact does it then have on the politics? Well, the Israeli war on Gaza is regarded by some as such a war, one which left Israel's image tarnished, its leaders accused of war crimes, its relationship with allies like Egypt and Turkey damaged, and the threat of Hamas rockets still ever present. And the kicker? Israeli elections just a little over 2 weeks away. Now, while the bloodshed continued in Gaza, public opinion in Israel remained firmly supportive of the offensive. 78% of people viewed it as a success, only 13% as a failure. But the harrowing pictures of the aftermath, you see them there. They raised a clamour of criticism elsewhere in the world. They divided Jewish opinion overseas. For example, Sir Gerald Kaufman, a leading figure in the British Labour Party, said, "My grandmother did not die to provide cover for Israeli soldiers murdering Palestinian grandmothers in Gaza." But it's in Israel where opinion will really matter, a battle of personalities, some of whom played big roles in the war, and parties, some of which have altered the political spectrum by shifting further to the right. We're going to talk more about the elections in the second half of our programme. Right now, though, we'll focus on the war itself and the impact it's had on the Israeli public and Israel's image. Joining us are our guests in Tel Aviv, Uri Avnery, a writer and a former Israeli Knesset member. In Jerusalem is Gerald Steinberg, the chair of political studies at Bar Ilan University. And in Nazareth is Jamal Zahalka, a member of the Knesset from the Arab Israeli Balad Bloc. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story. Uri Avnery in Tel Aviv, I'll come to you first. War often unites, it provides nationalism. I'm sure it did that in Israel. Tell me, though, about any voices of dissent in Israel to this war. How loud were they during those 3 weeks of conflict?
There was dissent from the first moment. A few hours after the war broke out, we demonstrated in front of the Ministry of Defense against the war. We were about 1,000 people. 1 week later, we marched through Tel Aviv with 10,000 people. And in the last few hours of the war, we made another march in Tel Aviv with 5,000 people. And throughout the war, we had 3 or 4 demonstrations all over the country. It's a definite minority who was against the war. One of the reasons being that the Israeli media and the world media totally ignored every expression of anti-war sentiment. You did not hear about our actions of the Israeli peace movement throughout the war anywhere, not in Israel, not outside Israel.
Gerald Steinberg in Jerusalem, I'll come to you now. I think it's fair to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you feel otherwise, that Israel's public image did, internationally at least, take quite a battering in this war. Did that register at all with the Israeli public, with the Israeli leadership?
Well, Israel always takes public battering. It's the images on television do not look good. They're often manipulated. You get a lot of propagandists. Nobody really cares about the suffering on the Israeli side. This is part of the war. The propaganda war, in fact, it very much accompanies the military war. I think there's some criticism that the Israeli government, the foreign ministry, could have done better at the beginning, could have prepared better. There were some unfortunate mistakes that were actually invited by Hamas. When you fire from a building building that houses journalists, then sometimes that building is going to get hit. We don't know what happened at the UNRWA school, but it's very possible that, in fact, there was firing at Israeli forces from UNRWA. But the Israelis generally know that there's such a lot of bias, there's a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of hatred, even from the first day of the war against Israel. And so that's taken for granted. It's unfortunate, and perhaps also if the type of hatred that was exhibited would be toned down and become more reasonable, if there wasn't all this double standards from the United Nations, and of course the usual types of coverage that we get in the Arab world, if there would have been a fairer approach to that, then perhaps Israelis would have taken some of these accusations more seriously. But overall, I don't think that's a minor aspect. And Israelis generally look at this as something they had to do. It was unpleasant, but Hamas determined the rules of the game, they determined the time, and to survive, Israel had to respond.
You talk about coverage in the Arab world, that of course includes this channel, which I'm sure you see coverage of there in Israel. The pictures that came out over 3 weeks, you must admit they were very stark images. They told an incredible story from inside Gaza of the suffering of those people. Again, does that not have an impact with the Israeli people when they do see those?
When you live in a country that is surrounded by enemies, tens of millions of people, who want to throw you into the sea, who talk about wiping Israel off the map, when you look at what happened in Gaza, Israel left in 2005 not a single Israeli soldier, no more occupation, no settlers, and what was the main industry? What did Hamas do with that freedom, with that ability to develop? They imported thousands and thousands of rockets. They dug tunnels to bring them in from Iran, from Syria. They preached hatred on their television channels. So this was a war that Hamas caused, they invited. There was unfortunately not any kind of significant protest. Uri Avnery and his crowd are perennial protesters in Israel. They have no impact. They're on the fringe, but they're out there. Where is the Palestinian equivalent? Who in the Palestinian community and society is saying to Hamas, you're leading us into complete destruction. You're preventing peaceful relations from developing with Israel. Your very extremist religious Islamic ideology is destroying everybody in the region. That's how the majority of Israelis start from this process. And when you've had years and years of suffering, where thousands and tens of thousands of Israelis have lived under rocket fire, when many of the families have been injured, people have been killed. For what? What was the purpose of all of this? There were no Israelis in Gaza. So how is it possible for Israelis to empathize and say this was our fault, when we know that in fact this came from Hamas, it was linked to Iran, it was planned, and all of the things that around it, all the images that we see are designed to help the Hamas propaganda campaign. It's a huge tragedy.
Short story there, the pictures didn't really have any impact. Uri Avnery, I'll just give you a quick reply before I go to Jamal Zahalka, just quickly.
Well, I envy Mr. Steinberg for being able to repeat all this propaganda nonsense with a straight face. It's not the Palestinians who occupy us for 60 years. We occupy all of Palestine. We did not put, it's not the Palestinians who put a blockade on 1.5 million Israelis. We made a blockade for 1.5 years, a total blockade on 1.5 million people in Gaza. You cannot turn everything around and really get people to believe that. People have seen what happened during the war. If you send an army, the fourth biggest army in the world, against a small strip of land densely populated, you have to expect, you know that you are going to kill many, many hundreds of people, including women and children. Was this not taken into account when the war was started? Didn't they know what they are doing?
Jamal Zahalka, waiting patiently for us there in Nazareth. I'd like to ask you about a slightly different issue now, because you and your party were, we could say, political casualties of this war, disqualified from the coming elections, recently reinstated just a couple of days ago. Should internal politics have become part of what is essentially an external war?
First of all, for us, it's not an external war. We are part of the Palestinian people, and we are suffering the suffering of our people. But I have to comment on one word that I heard, unpleasant actions in Gaza. killing 420 children is unpleasant. Killing 1,300 people is unpleasant. Destroying the infrastructure in Gaza is unpleasant. It's a war crime. And I think the Israeli leadership should pay for that in international tribunal. The timing of this war by Mr. Barak and Mrs. Livni was because of the new elections. And the end of this war also was the same. The intention to invade Gaza and make a war was before many months, but they choose this time to exchange Palestinian blood with the votes in Israeli elections. And they gained some support, especially Barak, but in the end of the day, I think they are supporting the right wing, although in Israel now you cannot see what's left and what's right in Israel. One of the Israeli left is more even brutal than the right wing. When the left and the middle stream in Israel make the war, they have automatic support from the right. But when the right make a war, there is some protest against this war inside Israel itself and in the international community. So there is something which restrain the Israeli violence. But when the left do it, the world and the Israeli public give them a free hand to make any crime they want to make, and they did intention crimes. They wanted to kill Palestinian civilians in order to terrify the Palestinian people, in order to repair the Israeli veterans, which was collapsed in the war against Lebanon. It's called calculation in this war, and I think killing was one of the goals of this war.
So Jamal Zahalka, they're talking about politics, and we're going to talk more about that after the break in a moment, looking closer at the coming Israeli elections and how what happened in Gaza might affect them. Back with more from our guests in just a moment.